Morning. I think it's ironic and indeed amusing to come here today to talk about movement when you're in urgent need of double knee surgery and you have enormous pain in my back and I'm having to sit down. And you might ask, what can an old fart like this really have to say about movement? Perhaps this morning we'll get an OAP's organ recital. Well, when I was invited to come here and give a short talk on the theme of movement, my immediate reaction was absolutely not. Just over a decade ago, I was shortlisted for a Visual Arts Award, and I was working in New York, and on the flight over to the ceremony in London, I tried to work out what I would say if I won. And I remembered a quotation I'd read in a thriller about the shenanigans in the art world, attributed to the great French painter Henri Matisse. And it was my speech. And Matisse said, all painters should have their tongues cut out. But this brief talk is about movement. It's not about painting. Because it is movement that has given my life direction. In fact, it's driven my life. In the last 4 decades, I've moved to various locations in England and Italy and tried to fuse the notion of the glance and the gaze. For the visual artist, the glance is essentially an Oriental idea, an Oriental concept. We glance at our surroundings as we move through them. And the gaze, a Western idea, we contemplate a view of our surroundings and we reflect on it. The stasis gives us an ability to ponder. Over a span of 40 years, many ideas affect you, and it is difficult, impossible probably, not to be affected by selective amnesia. But the one constant theme of a seeming insoluble paradox is the contradictory forces that I've tried to fuse. The theme persists today. How can you make imagery by hand-brain coordination that might have a weight, a gravitas, and yet movement on a three-dimensional object, a board or a canvas, with two-dimensional imagery, an organization of abstract markings that first signify to yourself, and then possibly another, and then if you're really lucky, others. Over the last 150 years, surely the use of photography, filmmaking, and video by mechanical devices would convey and have conveyed this sense of movement much better. Yet from my idiosyncratic perspective, the coordination of moving, glancing, and gazing at the image in a particular location engages me completely. And using one's hands is the perfect way to proceed. In fact, it's an absolute necessity. 40 years ago, as a visual artist who tried to make landscape painting in a European tradition, it became clear then, as it remains now decades later, that it was pointless, meaningless, futile to try, and would not perpetuate this tradition. But since I was first aware as a teenager, I've been fascinated, indeed obsessed, with Japanese Zen calligraphy, particularly the 18th century calligraphers Zengai and Tiger, and at the same time obsessed with the European tradition of Rubens and Ruysdael, Canink, Turner and Constable, etc. I revere these traditions and I love their artists. So how to fuse these ideas into something that has meaning for me? In 1978, I was living in a remote Pennine moorland village in northeast Lancashire. I stopped using chromatic material, oil paint, watercolours, etc., and I destroyed everything I could prior to this date. This was the point of my departure. I began walking each day around this village, taking with me small blocks of A4 size and A5 size, that's postcard size, acid-free paper. I began making rapid images with pencil and graphite. As I walked, I glanced and gazed, and at speed. This happened every day, and soon it was clear I had ritualized these walks. Each was circular, of a varying length, and took place each afternoon, every afternoon, at the same time. I walked, I glanced, and I gazed, building up literally hundreds, indeed thousands of images, destroying or editing images when I felt they meant nothing. Trees, woods, copses, farmhouses, barns, paths, stretches of moorland, the weather, the seasons, they all became familiars through this minimalistic repetition of glancing and gazing and moving and drawing. Because I'd thrown out oil paint, canvas, etc., I started working only with black and white material on the individual drawings each evening. I used black ink reinforced with shellac, which is a lustrous varnish which used to be made out of the crushed exoskeletons of insects. It's the same material that they used to make the 78 vinyl records in the 40s, 50s and 60s, Elvis Presley records. This gave the ink a density, a body, a durability and a permanence. To me, it was a new form of painting, but with mapping pens instead of brushes. These images were all individually mounted on boards and then pinned all around the walls of the cottage I lived in. After 3 years, I suddenly saw the hundreds of A4 and A5 images as multiple records of time and movement fused with stasis and contemplation. A Eureka moment. The tessellated grids of images, minutely worked with the dense marks made with mapping pens, had turned into a visual diary, a non-verbal record of my traces of my walking. So they are no longer pinned individually, they're assembled into grids, into tessellated grids, a mosaic of imagery. Some would contain 100 images, 72 images, 50 images, and so on. After 10 years, I moved away, and I lived in 4 other locations in England and 2 in Italy, with 2 other brief periods of intense activity in Provence, in France, and in Venice. 9 years ago, I finally arrived in North Norfolk by the North Sea. The walk I started making is linear along a shingle strand to Blakeney Point, which is a remote wildlife sanctuary at the most easterly point of England. It spirals out into the sea, next stop Bremerhaven. Once again, I've made thousands of rapid glancing drawings in small books this time, always on the same day, at the same time, once a week. Everything is still black and white. I use black water-soluble felt pens and soft black water-soluble crayons. And the water I use is seawater, which is to hand. The rest of the week, I used this huge compost of imagery, to attempt to wrench a perfect image of the sea. The sea, a perfect armature for constant movement and change. And the large paintings I work on through the week in the studio, the gaze, depicting nothing and everything. This is a walk into infinity, leaving a concrete image behind. That is the ambition I've pursued single-mindedly down the years, to fuse these two opposites and capture the moment, frozen and melting at the same time. An obsession I want so very much to continue to pursue, operations allowing. I'll end with a half-remembered favourite quotation from the great French 19th century painter Eugène Delacroix. Delacroix said, "It should be possible to capture a man in a drawing completely as he falls from the fifth-floor window to the ground. The glance producing the object of the gaze in a wholly inventive way." That, I guess, is the ambition I've been pursuing all my life. Thank you.